Okay, this is reel one of the May 31st, 1994 interview of Robert McCormick Adams in his office in the Smithsonian Building, and the interviewer is Pamela Henson for the Smithsonian Archives Oral History Program. And what I wanted to pick up with today is your tenures as director of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. Talk a little bit about what it was like when you got there and what your program was for it in a variety of ways: facilities, research, staffing, etc. So when you assumed the director, or when you were preparing to assume the directorship, what was its state at that point?
Well, let me go back a bit before
Sure.
that.
Mm-hmm.
Chicago had been the original locus of the Manhattan Project, and was impacted by that war work in a substantial way. And then, perhaps like most of the major universities, was the recipient of a large flow of returning veterans. And the American Veterans Committee was then a liberal, very active veterans organization, and I was active in that. And that sense of involvement in the world was strong for a relatively few years. My impression is, having gone away from the campus in the spring of 1949 and then returning in the fall of 51, and not having spent much time on the campus at all in between, that when I came back it had become very much a traditional academic campus again. That was moving into the McCarthy period, and there were a lot of quiet ramifications of that.
Loyalty oaths.
Affecting some scholars in my own department of anthropology. A man named Robert Armstrong lost his job over that. Not directly over that. There was enough due process that it didn't appear quite that openly, but that was essentially it. There were other issues involved. Chicago, on the whole, handled that better than most universities, I think, but there was no doubt that the pressures were very heavy. The Oriental Institute was really a serene island in terms of those pressures. Yeah. The great majority of its faculty were foreign. I don't know. I can't say that they had come as refugees, because many had come already before the war. But
that intellectual migration.
Yeah, they were part of the European intellectual migration of the 30s and then the wartime years. And one would have to go through and count them up, but my guess is that in the middle to late 50s, that would have applied to 3/4 of the staff of the Oriental Institute. It was not a serene island in any other way, except that it was not part of the larger American academic scene. It was a place with very strong personalities, with strong rivalries, with one might almost say fierce views of what they thought was good and proper, and of what they disliked in their colleagues. And now that I think about it, I think there had been at least one Nazi on the faculty during the war. He was gone by the time I got there, but I mean, that's merely to say that it was not all an anti-fascist stream of refugees. It was
Right.
a European stream. What were the primary currents? It's very hard to distinguish them in any simple terms. The people who had come were part of an exceedingly well-trained tradition in philological terms,
Okay. Right.
who also had mature historical and philosophical training. And they were prepared to speak in very broad ways about the civilizations of the ancient Near East. Some of them were specialists in the narrow sense, but the eminent people were all eminent, at least in part, for their breadth. Mm-hmm. And that's a quality which is much harder to find today. I've had occasion to remark in print on the sort of retreat into specialization that's gone on since. I think of people like Gustav von Grünebaum, who was at Chicago until sometime in the 60s. He then went out to start what became the von Grünebaum Center at UCLA. His book on medieval Islam was one of the great classic syntheses of that subject. Torkild Jakobsen, who I have already commented on, was one of the great Sumerologists of our time or any time. And he was a Dane who had come to Chicago, I think around 1930, and had worked in the field on Oriental Institute expeditions, so that he was also reasonably conversant with an older style of archaeology. But he wrote a whole series of major works on Sumerian society and religion and so on, synthetic works of a scope that people don't do, or certainly don't do as well now, with some exceptions, but in general I think you can say that. There was a titanic struggle that I found myself in the middle of between Jakobsen on the one hand and A. Leo Oppenheim, who was this was a German Jewish refugee, who became the head of the Assyrian Dictionary. And the Assyrian Dictionary had begun in Chicago in the 1920s, and between then and 1950 had not produced a single volume. Now, it was an immense task to convert the material from hundreds of thousands of texts into passages that could then be in some way coded and collected and collated and what have you. But even so, that was it was not designed to go anywhere. Right. It was a project that allowed people to justify an interest in words rather than to produce a dictionary. Leo Oppenheim, while he was a Hegelian in terms of his point of view, was also fiercely determined to make the ancient Near East live for a new generation of American students who would need a dictionary if it was ever to become a well-taught and well-studied body of achievement. And to go from an interest in words to a practical dictionary requires making many compromises, which Oppenheim was willing to make, many mistakes, which he also made. And one of the things that I found myself called upon to do in coming into as director of the Oriental Institute was to make a decision between Jakobson, who had a vision, as he once put it, of a perfect Greek statue, which may have no arms and legs, but is perfect, as compared with a Roman statue that may be intact, but of lesser quality. And Leo was prepared to put out the dictionary, and for as long as he lived, it was coming out at a great rate. It's about 80% out now, and it's again in the doldrums. The woman who has now been the editor-in-charge since Leo's death, Erika Reiner, is Hungarian by birth. She was another one of the European diaspora who came. I hope she finishes it in her lifetime.
Yeah.
But the outcome of that particular struggle was that Jakobson, having lost, went off to Harvard. And but by any reckoning, both Jakobson and Oppenheim were astonishingly splendid scholars. They truly were. Well, one can go on beyond that. John Wilson, he was an American, who had been the director of the Oriental Institute at an earlier time, came from a missionary background and had taught at, I think his initial teaching job had been at the American University of Beirut in the early 1920s. And John was the only example in the senior, and he was maybe the only American in the senior group there, who came away from World War II with a sense that something new was needed in terms of what was then called area studies. That was a focus of concern that the Ford Foundation had introduced and was putting some money into. And John was trying to build a broad coalition of humanities and social sciences behind something that was integrated across time and went from the ancient past up to the present. And he did not get much resonance out of his colleagues in the Oriental Institute. There was apart from John, who was an Egyptologist, there's quite a large number of other Egyptologists who, on the whole, were not comparable, in my own judgment, to the Assyriologists in their quality. I'm skipping over a lot of people who also had very important qualities who came then. I.J. Gelb, who became an important student of the ancient Near Eastern economy. Miguel Seville, a Spanish former Jesuit, who in linguistic terms is a great scholar. The problem is that the older generation, Hans Guterbach, whom I think I've already mentioned, in the Hittite field, the problem is that as the older generation moved into retirement or moved away, they left people who were very able, but who were less inclined to try to speak to the world about what they were doing, and who were much more sensitive to the criticisms of their colleagues that forced them into narrower and narrower specializations.
Yeah.
And I think that was a development that was very hard to fight, but maybe it was inevitable. It was going on throughout the humanities. Our money in those days came primarily from the university. The Oriental Institute had an initial endowment from Rockefeller himself, John D. And in the late 50s, the director of the Oriental Institute had been a man named Carl Kraling. And Carl was brought in as an outsider. And I learned a lot about administration from Carl because he was a tough-minded administrator in in a place that didn't welcome him, and he nevertheless did very well in.
Yeah.
And I think he came from Yale. He'd been part of the Dura Europos excavations in Syria in the 1930s. And I became an assistant to Carl.
Okay.
In fact, I think he and I co-edited a book in the late 50s. And I was therefore getting an introduction to administration under Carl. It frankly never occurred to me that I'd be involved as the director, but that was happening. And in fact, I cannot now recall how in the hell I did become director. I mean, it just happened.
Yeah. Was it in any way because you were not locked into these conflicts?
It's conceivable. It is, but I don't. I mean, it's really hard to say. There was a sense. Look, Carl became ill. I think he had heart trouble, and I think therefore his stepping down was not planned, but became necessary. But before he stepped down, he had secured another major grant from Rockefeller. Now it was John D. Jr. The old man was gone. And there was a prospect of more interesting fieldwork.
Yeah.
And I had opened up one interesting line with archaeological surveys that I was doing. And that was certainly part of what they looked ahead and saw themselves doing.
Okay.
Bob Braidwood, under whom I had first gone to the field, was continuing with his work on early villages and the beginnings of agriculture. And that had been an exceedingly promising line that, in effect, created a field, mostly among anthropologists.
Yeah.
And if you were to talk to someone like Bruce Smith here, Bruce would say that that was sort of historically decisive, what Bob was doing at the time. And in fact, I recall sitting in Bob Braidwood's office in 52 or 3, where I had a desk, and the representative came in from the National Science Foundation, which had excluded the social sciences when it was first set up, and was interested in finding a way of getting beyond that exclusion, and had chosen precisely work on the beginnings of agriculture because it involved syntheses of scientific material and archaeological excavations and social theories and whatever. And I think the first project they funded was Braidwood's project. So that it was a very important thing in its own way, and clearly that was going to go on, and that was another major theme. So there was very interesting work of that kind. Something that looked promising but turned out to be less so was the building of the high dam at Aswan on the Nile. The Oriental Institute had a substantial piece of the action, but it fell into the hands of a man named Keith Seeley, who was trained as a philologist and who had a very limited view of either what archaeology could do or of any of the broader interpretive questions that ought to come out of excavating up in that area. And the result was that we excavated thousands upon thousands of pots and put them in the museum, and fair amounts of perishable material like cloth and what have you, but made very little contribution to the kinds of questions which are now dominant, like the relations between Africa and Egypt, for example. What else was current at the time in the way of projects? Excavations were going on at the Sumerian city of Nippur. They're still going on there whenever anybody can get into Iraq. That project had begun under Pennsylvania back in the 1890s and was taken up by Chicago at the end of the 1940s and has continued ever since. And as the Sumerian religious city, it was an important focus of work, and there were very interesting results coming up. So we were clearly active in that field as well. So the 60s were a time with interesting field work going on, with significant progress on things like the Assyrian Dictionary, with a series of powerful monographs still appearing.
Yeah.
It was a good time.
Yeah. Yeah, there'd always been a strong publication program
Always.
out of
It
the
has,
institute
it
itself,
has a
right?
huge
Yeah.
series of OIPs, Oriental Institute publications, and SAOC, Studies in Ancient Oriental Civilization. It's always had a big program. The later volumes are less philosophical, less synthetic, more detailed. But it's a program of very high technical standards.
It seems unusual in the sense of having an organization that can provide the field money, the curatorial support, the publication support
well,
for
it's a
scholars.
tradition which you could say it goes with the sciences in part. The image of the Oriental Institute was to be a scientific institute, but in the humanities, and more like the Institute for Advanced Study, or what would be some other examples? Well, there were institutes at Chicago that were functioning at the same time. The James Franck Institute, the Enrico Fermi Institute, over in physics and physical chemistry and so on. So it existed then. The federal sources of support were they were coming up, but they weren't up to the present standards, so that if you didn't have that kind of money, you didn't do field work. And the few institutions that did were the ones that had all the activity. In those days, it was really Chicago and Pennsylvania, and not much else. I mean, that's really the way it was. And then it continued to spread out as NSF and then the endowments came along. But it was very limited at that time.
Now, had your colleagues accepted your more anthropological approach and your more material culture and?
Well, I wish I could give you a correct answer. I'm not sure.
Or did that?
I think I was accepted.
Yeah.
I mean, after all, I did repeatedly get put back in again.
Right.
But I was accepted in part because I was a piece of both and was able to perform in that role. And I would be hard put to say that I really moved them to become different on this score than they were before I got there. We got along very well, not merely amicably, but I think constructively. But I'm not sure that was a consequence of any persuasive success on my part.
I wondered if any linkages were being developed with other university departments. I think of, in that period of time, urban studies becoming a field.
Well, I was active in urban studies, and I organized some urban studies meetings through the SSRC and so on. But you see, I had an appointment also in anthropology, and I could move back and forth just by crossing the street. And they need not concern themselves with what I did on the other side of the street. So that there was no need for this to come together in some way.
Now, once you became director, were there personnel opportunities to move the staff in that direction, or?
There really were not, because the standards of the Institute, which were humanistic standards, were very high, and the social scientists who might someday conform to those standards weren't yet being produced. Later on they came, or they began to come. But one would have had to go in a different direction.
Yeah.
We trained some of those who certainly could have gone in that direction, but it's also the case that even now there haven't been very many.
Yeah.
And some of those who I thought were most impressive and who should have been impressive on philological grounds as well were not taken. And I can only think that reflects in part an unreadiness to move in that direction.
Yeah.
So I convinced myself that these matters change very slowly over long periods of time. And it certainly didn't take place during the 60s while I was directing the Oriental Institute.
Yeah. Now, were there loss of facilities with the turmoil in the Middle East? How much of that took up your time as director in those years?
Not really. Obviously, there were moments of confusion and trouble. We had to shut down Chicago House, which was our main base in Luxor in Egypt, and it's a great research base there with the best library, best Egyptological library anywhere outside of a couple of countries of Western Europe and the United States. We had to shut that down during the Suez Crisis for some time, maybe a year or two. We got pushed out of Iraq by the Iraq Revolution in '58 for maybe a year and a half. What else suffered? Not during those. I mean, I think I mentioned last time that I periodically had trouble myself getting a permit to work. But no, the sense was still that the Israeli-Arab questions were going to be solved any day now, and people were optimistic. Iran was open. The Shah was in power. We began work. Also, I went out and found a marvelous site on one of my surveys in Iran, and then another Oriental Institute expedition took up work there.
What site was that?
Chogamish. There was a sense of so much to do, and new methods were coming forward all the time in the natural sciences, and one had the sense of really an open horizon, and if we could get more money, we could do anything. And, little bits of money came in from various other places. I got some from the American Schools of Oriental Research. I don't remember at the moment where the grants were coming from, but they were small, and mostly it was internally generated or coming in from friends of the Oriental Institute. And the Institute did have a group of loyal friends around it there in Chicago. That pretty well takes us through, I think.
Did you have any specific goals when you took over as director? Programs?
Well, I think there was this sense of an expansive horizon in every direction. What could we do? And you didn't really need to have goals because there was so much to do that if you could get the people, you could do wonderful things. Obviously, if I had goals, they would have been to generate more work in social and economic history, more work of an interdisciplinary character that brought in the sciences and the social sciences. And I don't mean to say there was none, but I can't say that it fundamentally changed the character of the place.
One of the things you've worked on here very hard was a more diverse workforce. Was that something that?
No, that really was not, to be
Yeah.
honest with you. I think I was
Before its
concerned, I
time,
know I
yeah.
was concerned about creating some positions for women. And I think I was indeed involved in bringing in a very good woman Egyptologist who's still there. And a couple of others, but there were no diverse types to bring in
Yeah.
ancient Oriental languages.
Yeah,
There still are very few.
yeah.
But,
And there weren't students coming from the Middle East, were there?
yes, there were.
Right,
There were some. And some, in fact, my colleagues and I brought back with us people who'd been assigned to
Yeah,
work with us in the field as inspectors or whatever. So there was a continuing stream of young Middle Eastern colleagues who came. And there were visiting professors from Western Europe, but also from the Middle East, who came and were in residence for a time and who made the place diverse in that sense. But certainly in terms of the U.S. definitions of diversity, there was nobody then.
yeah, back in that. I wondered if the scholars there felt similar type of stresses that scholars here do, between trying to get field work done, curation, and I wondered who handled the curation, and getting your writing done,
Not
public
really.
programming. No?
It was an extraordinary place. There was just a tiny handful of people who cared about curation at all. There was no sense of changing exhibitions.
Okay, so there wasn't a pressure.
The exhibitions were sort of standard demonstrations of what the Institute had done in some place or other. And obviously new cases got built and things got put in them from time to time, but there were not more than 2 or 3 people who cared a damn about any of that. And there were very few students. Basically, people were doing their own work.
And not worrying much about the actual curation. So it was. So you didn't have those kind of stresses. Interesting.
No, archaeologists who went to the field had a problem because
Right.
they came back with all this stuff that they
Right.
had to prepare for publication.
Right. Okay, this is reel 2 of the May 31st interview of Robert McCormick Adams. So you were saying in order to get these large collections handled,
Well, that's always been a problem
Yeah.
with excavations.
Right.
And
graduate
it's really
students.
still a problem, but certainly then it was the case that there was never really a match between the number of personnel whom universities could place in their own department or whatever, and the size of the staff needed to process the finds. So there was always a flow of volunteers mending pots and students incorporating them in dissertations in one way or the other. I don't mean to say there were no students. There were students in philology and history too, but the numbers were relatively small.
Right.
It was a wonderful place to work.
Yeah.
So,
What you mentioned you co-authored with the director.
mhm.
Would you do much discussion, interaction with the other scholars?
Well, that was a
of
book
writing?
that came out of a symposium that he and I both sort of ran. The book was called City Invincible,
Okay.
and it was on urban life, and there really wasn't any other occasion like that. It's the kind of thing that Carl Kraling wanted to do when he came and hoped to do more of, and I would say it was a graft that didn't take.
Mm-hmm.
It was too I don't mean quite to say to social science. That may have been true too. But just at a time when specialization was becoming narrower, it tried to go in a broad direction.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
may have been 5 years too late.
Yeah. Or too soon, as things are now moving
Yeah.
sort of back in that direction again, as people need the overviews to do the more specialized work.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what other people I should mention. Obviously, there were lots of others with some of whom I worked very closely, but I think I've touched on the major ones.
And now you stepped down from that when you had the opportunity to get back in the field. Is that correct? That was, I have the date here.
Wait a minute. Yes, I stepped down in June of '68, having completed 6 years,
Right,
and went off to Iraq again in the fall of '68.
right.
And in fact, took the family out.
Must have been an adventure for them.
Well, they'd been out before once.
Yeah.
They'd been out in they were out in 57, 58 also, yeah.
Create any long-standing interests in the
Not
field?
really.
Yeah.
The two older girls were placed in an Iraqi school in the year we were out there,
Yeah.
and I think loved it,
Yeah.
but it isn't that they continued in that area.
Yeah. But affects them in the sense of just that cultural exposure that
That may have
changes
made
you.
a difference.
Yeah.
Well, one of them is now a Buddhist and spends a lot of time in India and Tibet. The other one is a Balinese specialist. They
Huh.
don't work in the same areas, but,
Yeah,
but you could argue there's a connection.
yeah. So you went back out in the field, but then in 1970, after you'd come back from field work, accepted the position as Dean of the Social Science
right.
faculty. And
That's right.
how did that come about, and why were you interested in doing that? What did that entail?
Well, I don't know that I was really.
Yeah.
I was asked to do it, and I would have been much more interested in going on in the field, but that, as I think I
Yeah.
mentioned,
Couldn't do
didn't
it.
look like it would be possible. And I was interested in broad social science questions,
Yeah.
which I could not pursue in the Oriental Institute, and this was a chance to I really sort of went back and forth between anthropology and Near Eastern studies, and with one
Yeah.
seemingly closing down, it was a chance to move in the other direction. And I'd been on and was still on a number of Social Science Research Council. I think I was on the Middle East Joint Committee at the time. I was on a number of boards that were involved from a social science perspective. It was a natural thing to do, to be
Yeah.
honest. It was
Yeah.
not so surprising.
Yeah. Were there any more opportunities there for creating interdisciplinary interactions and bringing in broader staff?
Well, that was again a good period in the social sciences.
Yeah.
And Chicago may very well have been at the top of the heap
Yeah.
in the social sciences in that period. And there was not a need to maintain standards and to exercise good judgment. There was not a need to go charging up the hill in some new direction.
Right.
And I think I was a very effective dean, and I think I was admired as a dean, in fact. But it was being a dean in a great institution in a period when money was plentiful and when the question was to spend it wisely.
Yeah. But this was the period of time when there's a lot of turmoil on most campuses.
There was a lot of turmoil. You're quite right.
And did that affect your school
Well,
and
sure,
faculty?
it did, and we had our troubles with SDS and all the rest. I think Chicago, there were one or two sit-ins of one kind or another. but I don't. I think Chicago behaved well, and I think and there were no major crises as a result of any of these. There were minor crises, but I think we basically worked our way through them in a pretty effective way.
Yeah, yeah. Because when I think of the Chicago Convention, you know, the '68 convention.
Well, that
and
was
all that, I
lively,
mean,
yes,
you-
but
yeah.
and there were certainly people who were confronting the system and the Democratic Party and so on in '68 in Chicago,
Yeah.
and in fact, our whole family went down and were witnesses as the streets were getting torn up and so on. But no, it was not something that was
Traumatic.
it was not traumatic for the
Yeah.
university in the
Yeah.
same sense.
Yeah, 'cause some universities, such as Cornell, it was really just sort of
Cornell had a rough time.
tore the place apart. Yeah, yeah.
Sometime in that period, and I'm not altogether sure when, Dan Burston came from Chicago down to the Museum of American History here.
Right, right.
And
That's right. Yeah.
Dan had his classes leafleted at Chicago. That this man was an informer, and so on and so on and so on. And I suppose it's quite likely, although I don't know this, that student hostility played a part in Dan's decision to come to Washington. But that's the only case like that
Yeah.
I'm familiar with.
Yeah. Just at least a healthy response to
Mm-hmm.
change and questioning.
Well, Chicago was never, I mean, those were also the Vietnam years,
Yeah.
of course. And unlike Cornell, which had a large Southeast Asian program, and that program was in the thick of a lot of quasi-military
Yeah.
planning and activity, Chicago never got into any of that.
Yeah.
So that there was never the same sense of tension on the campus
Yeah. That you had.
over those issues.
Yeah.
I'm sure there were members of faculties who may even have been advisors to the government or
Yeah.
something, but they were not doing so
Yeah.
with the university as the instrumentality.
Right.
That may help to explain why
Yeah,
it came
it was
through.
calmer. And then you sort of moved back and forth a bit. Through '74, you were dean, and then went back out in the field again.
That's right.
Things quieted down. You went back out in the field to finish the canal study in Iraq.
Yeah.
Um,
And the next fieldwork I did, I think, was '77.
Saudi Arabia.
In Saudi Arabia.
You were also named Harold H. Swift Distinguished Service Professor.
Yeah,
of
I don't remember when
Anthropology.
that happened, but that's in my CV, I guess.
Yeah, that's '75.
Yeah.
So that was
Uh,
still maintaining the dual status then.
Oh, I maintained it at all times I was there, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But then returned to the deanship in '79 through '80.
Well, I owed them a year because I'd left a year early in order to
Okay.
catch up on that Iraqi possibility,
Yeah.
and they didn't forget it. And Bill Kruskell, who succeeded me, was offered a year at Oxford, and so I agreed to relieve him for a year in '79, '80 in order to let him
Right.
get the Oxford thing in. I think it was Oxford.
Ah,
And
okay.
so that was simply
Yeah.
an informal debt, but
Right.
a debt that I was happy to repay in that
Yeah.
form.
And then
And then I became director of the Oriental Institute again.
right.
And I don't quite remember why that happened. I don't, in fact, I guess George Hughes had been the director, an Egyptologist, and I think he hit retirement age. And my recollection may be wrong, but my guess is that they tried to find another and couldn't find anybody they were satisfied with, and I agreed to take it.
Yeah.
I don't think I expected to make a full term out of it because I was doing other things. And in fact, I guess it was in the spring of '82, I went and taught at San Diego, and was really very interested in San Diego and was thinking of going there. I don't remember quite
Yeah.
what was up in the Oriental Institute. By that time, my feeling was that the Institute, but also the humanities, were in a retrograde condition, that they were getting too defensive in orientation. Not that there weren't very good people, but they weren't doing work that was as broad or exciting as it had been.
Yeah, yeah. And then in '82, you moved into the position of provost.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
an even broader
Yeah.
scale. How did that come about, or what challenges
Well,
did
I
that
guess
pose?
Hannah Gray asked me.
Yeah,
And by then I was aware that it really wasn't likely that I would get back into the kind of field work that I would have loved to resume.
yeah,
And I don't think I decided what to do next. That looked like a good way to sort of think about things. I suspect that was about the time that I went on the Council of the National Academy of Sciences for the first time.
yeah, I think that's right.
And I was becoming very much involved in science policy questions here in Washington, and there was a program in public policy that became a school presently at Chicago, and I also had an appointment there.
Uh-huh.
So that, you could say, was in part compensating for the fact that what I had been doing looked like it was
Yep.
gradually attenuating.
Yeah, yeah. What were the challenges of being provost?
Well, big, complex institution with, by this time, with resources becoming very short.
Yeah, yeah.
What do you do with the urgent demands of the physical sciences from one direction and the hospital and the biological sciences from another? With probably greater intellectual strength in the social sciences, but with nothing comparable in the way of income from indirect costs and so on. It was looking at large organizations and having a major hand in how they ran.
Yeah.
I certainly didn't go into that with a great program. Insofar as there was a program, it would have been Hannah's.
Yeah.
But Hannah and I think, worked together very effectively. And
Had you known her very long?
yes, I think I had been dean for that first time in the early 1970s when I believe she first received tenure as a young historian at Chicago.
Yeah.
She didn't stay. She then went off to Northwestern. But I think I was
So you,
the dean at that time.
So knew her way back.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we'd known each other well. We had not.
Okay. So hadn't worked closely with
We
her
had not
on
worked
committees
closely,
or
no.
projects or things like
No.
that? No. Okay, interesting. But just had known you as an administrator.
Yeah,
at the
and I
dean
was
level.
known to be somebody who had a lot of ties in the sciences.
Yeah.
Remember, in addition to everything else, my wife Ruth had been editor of the Bulletin of the Atomic Sciences and
Right.
had been active in the physical sciences and to some
Yeah.
extent the biological ones for all those years, so that we were quite unusual, maybe almost unique in talking across the whole campus.
Being able to speak to
Yeah.
both worlds,
Yeah,
to
So undoubtedly,
yeah.
that was a part of all that.
And the interest in science policy or
yeah.
research policy probably
Yeah,
is a better way to term it as well.
Yeah. Okay?
Okay, that's what I wanted to cover today. Thank you.